Each year there are some students that have to postpone a thesis or finishing a course due to the fact that they committed plagiarism. In this video, I'll explain what plagiarism is.
When you write an academic text, whether it's a very brief summary that is part of the course and it's just maybe one page, or an entire essay as the final exam of the course, or an entire bachelor or master thesis, those are all exams. And if you cheat on an exam, that's fraud. Fraud has consequences. Usually you are not allowed to do the course that semester you want to do it in. So that means that at the very least you have a delay of half a year for that course. And if that's your thesis, of course, it has at very least the consequences that you graduate half a year later. And that's the very least. In the worst case scenario, of course, you are expelled from university. Now, plagiarism is one type of fraud. Posing as someone else during an exam is also fraud. Using ChatGPT is also fraud. Writing a thesis for someone else is fraud. So I'm not going into all those types of fraud. I'm looking at plagiarism now. And what is plagiarism? Which you're not supposed to do, of course. You're not supposed to commit plagiarism. For philosophy at Tilburg University, there are two definitions that are relevant. That is the definition of Tilburg University and the description of the Tilburg School of Humanities and Digital Science. So let's first take a look at our university's description or definition of what is plagiarism. So using parts of a text written by someone else, or the reasoning or ideas of others for a thesis or other assignment without due acknowledgement. So you have to acknowledge when you use the ideas and text that are not your own. The Tilburg School of Humanities and Digital Sciences has in the rules and guidelines of the examination board the following: taking from or paraphrasing data, text, argumentations or thoughts from others in a thesis or other project without proper reference to the source. Okay, so that's basically similar and that looks easy enough. This seems easy enough, simple enough. Don't pass off someone else's work as yours. No ideas, no sentences, not entire text, of course, but every year there are some students, even in a small group as that of, say, 100 students in philosophy at Tilburg University that graduate each year, there still are students that commit fraud, plagiarism being one of them, and we see all kinds of plagiarism. So very common is when there is a part of the text by some philosopher that's really difficult to understand. Maybe the philosopher didn't explain it properly. It's very hard to understand, so the student copies the text, pastes it into their own essay or assignment or thesis, and then they do not put quotation marks around, they do not provide a reference, and therefore they commit fraud, they commit plagiarism. And then the defense often is, I didn't know that this was plagiarism. But it is, because it's passing off someone else's work as their own. So here are some cases of what constitutes plagiarism. So let's take a look at some examples so that this defense, I didn't know that this constituted plagiarism, is no longer acceptable. The most obvious case of plagiarism is when you copy and paste a text without using quotation marks and without using a reference. So you just copy a text, you put it in your own text, and that's it. So you have to use quotation marks, or if it's a very large number of words, you can't do that too often in your text, of course, but every now and then you will have a quote that is quite long, several sentences, then you use a block citation, so you have a different layout for that, And because it has a different layout, that functions like quotation marks, so your reader knows, these are not the words of the author I am reading now, it is a quote. And then of course you put a reference behind that, you always will do that. If you don't do that, it is plagiarism. So if you copy and paste a text, then this is a quote, it's a citation, and you should do that according to a certain format, like APA or Chicago style referencing. So in this clip, I'll use examples of APA style quoting and referencing. Okay, so let's take a look at one of these typical examples. So the original text is the following. It's from a book that Maurice Herman and I wrote. It's about Francis Bacon and his idols of the marketplace. So we say, idols of the marketplace are those distorted beliefs that stem from common language. People are often inclined to think that words used in language refer to things that really exist, where this need not necessarily be the case. Okay, so if you write a thesis or a piece of text on Bacon and you want to explain idols of the marketplace, you could use this explanation. You copy and paste it, and if that's what you do, if that's the only thing you do, then you commit plagiarism, because then you make it look like this is your explanation of what Bacon meant by idols of the marketplace, and it isn't, it's ours. So what it should look like is the following. Basically, and this is according to APA, right? So you put quotation marks around it, and then you put, in this case, the names of the authors, the year, and the page number. Sometimes, if you have a different way of referencing, it will be a footnote, for instance. So in Chicago, you use footnotes, and in many cases, you put then the entire reference there. The idea is that you put a reference behind a quote. Sometimes we see that students do something very similar to copy and pasting, but with a twist. So what they do is they copy and paste a text. They don't provide references. They also do not use quotation marks. And then they think they are smart. That is, they use the program they're working in. So say you're working in Word, to find synonyms for certain words. Therefore, they hope that the plagiarism scanner would not detect plagiarism. But we don't need a scanner for that, because usually such sentences turn out to be what are called tortured phrases. They are really strange ways of saying things, because the synonyms are not actually synonyms, at least not in this in this context. So for instance, if you replace big with colossal and data with information in this example, the company collected big data for analysis, then you get the tortured phrase, the company collected colossal information for analysis. That means something different, even though at first sight it might look very similar, but it isn't. So to use our previous example, so if you use Word to find synonyms, then the original text we already saw then becomes something like this. If you look up what the synonym for idols is, then you get deities. So Word actually changes idols into deities. Deities of the marketplace, well, then you got your phrasing all wrong. That's not the type of word, that's not the word that Francis Bacon used. And then also language is a synonym. It's strange, but it is something that word actually suggests is a synonym for words. So then you get a sentence like this. People are often inclined to think that languages used in language refer to things that really exist. Well, what type of odd sentence is that? But we do see these things happen. And this again is plagiarism. So what should this look like? Well, basically the same as the previous example. What you need to do is leave the sentences as they were. Don't use synonyms. Put quotation marks around them and a reference behind it. This type of fraud, this type of plagiarism, we see often occur when students are not very confident in their own English skills. A third example of plagiarism is when you copy and paste a text, you translate it or you have it translated by Google Translate or something like that, and then present it without quotation marks and reference as if you wrote that text. So even if you translated the entire text, this is plagiarism. What you could do, of course, is take an English text, copy and paste it into Google Translate, have Google Translate make a translation into Dutch, for instance, maybe change a couple of words because then you improve the translation, and then you come up with something like that's here on the screen. But when you do not put quotations marks around them and no reference, then this is plagiarism. These are not your own ideas if you present them like this. This is not your explanation of what Bacon meant by idols of the marketplace. So what should this look like? I hope it doesn't surprise you that you should use quotation marks and put a reference behind it. Also put in the reference that you translated it. So put my translation there. In Dutch this becomes of course mijn vertaling. Then your reader knows that the translation is yours, but the ideas are of someone else. So if you translate something and you do not provide a reference, if you do not provide the quotation marks, then this is plagiarism. Even though there might be some institutions like the APA that consider translations to be paraphrases. I don't know why they consider that, but we certainly don't. A translation is a translation. So we have loads of books that are translated into Dutch or from Dutch to English or another language. And you never say this is a paraphrase. You always say this is a translation, and you say that the translation of a book by Immanuel Kant, for instance, is a good translation if it's a good one-to-one match. And you don't say, well, I've translated it, well, didn't really translate it, I paraphrase it. Well, okay, but then it's your interpretation, your explanation. So a paraphrase and a translation are totally different, even though some institutions like APA might not consider them to be different. They are different. We consider a translation not a paraphrase, so it needs quotation marks and a reference. So you have been warned about this. You cannot use that for your defense. Right, so and this also might go for other things that almost everyone regards as plagiarism. If you find some institution that doesn't regard, well, some example I just gave as plagiarism, you cannot use that as your defense that you did not commit plagiarism. We gave the examples, those are very clear, so therefore if you do something that I just explained, then that is plagiarism. And there is more. There is also something that is called self-plagiarism, and that is presenting your own work as new while it isn't. So copying or paraphrasing one's own existing work in whole or in part, already done for another course, without the permission of the examiner. This is from the rules and guidelines of the examination board of Tilburg School of Humanities and Digital Sciences. And it's article 15J. You're not allowed to do this. Of course, you see this happen with philosophers that they have some concept and they use that concept in many of their papers, and then they just copy and paste their own ideas into the next paper. That is self-plagiarism, and well, it depends on the journal whether they allow that. We don't allow it unless, of course, you have permission of the examiner. So it could be the case that you wrote an essay or a small assignment for a course and that you agree with that lecturer when this lecturer also becomes your supervisor for a thesis, that you can use part of them. My advice is always refer to your own work then, so that at least you make clear to your reader that you said this already somewhere else. Let me give one other example of plagiarism, and that is when you paraphrase without providing a reference. So you present ideas that are not your own as if they are yours. So you should give credit to the author there as well. And in this case, you have not copy-pasted a text, but you actually have described the ideas of someone else in your own words, and then it looks like they are yours. So these ideas look like they are yours. But of course, you also need to provide a reference. So let me give you a bit over-the-top example. So take a for philosophers well-known text by Descartes. So I got this from a 1985 book, but the original, of course, was 1637. So immediately I noticed that while I was trying thus to think everything false, it was necessary that I, who was thinking this, was something. And observing that this truth, I am thinking, therefore I exist, was so firm and sure, I decided that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. Now you could paraphrase this and present it as if they were your own. These ideas, this idea or set of ideas. So you could do something like this. In my effort to try to consider all my former beliefs as false, I noticed that I, who was thinking that a belief was false, was something. And from this I concluded I had to exist when I was thinking. I found an absolute truth. I think, therefore I am. Okay. Any philosopher would see that this is not your idea. So any teacher would say, okay, this is plagiarism. So you have to do this slightly different if you want to do this, if you want to use this idea to get to another point you probably want to make in your essay. You should write something like this. In his effort to try to consider all his former belief as false, he noticed that he who was thinking that a belief was false was something, and from this he concluded that he had to exist when he was thinking. I think, therefore I am, was the absolute truth Descartes had found. Descartes, and then you provide a proper reference. So that's how you should do it when you paraphrase, when you write ideas of about the ideas of someone else in your own words. So it's not a citation, but still you have to acknowledge that those are not your ideas. Any lecturer that suspects fraud will report this to the examination board. Then the student usually is called to defend himself in some type of hearing, and then the examination board decides whether it was indeed plagiarism or another type of fraud, and decides upon the consequences. The consequences usually are that your essay, thesis, exam is not valid. You're also not allowed to do the resit if it wasn't a resit. And that means that you have to go for the next opportunity. That's the very least of the sanctions, the implications or the consequences of committing fraud. So at the very minimum, you have half a year delay before graduating. But if the course is a course that is given a year later, then you have a year of a delay of a year, and the same goes for a thesis, because you have to come up with a new plan. That might also take a couple of months, and then you have to write the thesis, so that's also very close to a delay of a year, and that's the very minimum, of course. The punishment or the consequence could be severe. So you have been warned.
That's it. Stay safe and don't plagiarize.